Hey everybody, happy Thursday. I hope that I'm finding you well. I'm sorry that I've not been on here for a few days. I've been having a little bit of difficulty with my devices wanting to access Facebook Live, but we're getting it figured out. So, one of the things that was hardest for me whenever I was young was learning to say I'm sorry, especially when I didn't feel sorry. You might find that sometimes when you're really angry or you feel justified and not really hard to say I'm sorry and apologize to that person and really mean it. So thinking about this topic reminds me of it is my favorite book of all time. I actually own the whole box set of Anne of Green Gables. They have been my favorite books since I was a very, very young child. And there's a part in it where Rachel, who lives near Anne's new home when she's adopted, she says some not very kind things to Anne, and Anne says some very, very, very unkind things back because her feelings were hurt. She was very insulted. And there comes a part where Marilla, the lady that adopts Anne and that she goes to live with, she makes Anne apologize. And she feels like she was right in what she said to Mrs. Rachel, even though what she said was very unkind. So I'm just going to read a few minutes of this, and it's quite a humorous part of the book. So this is called Anne's Apology. Marilla said nothing to Matthew about the affair that evening, but when Anne proved still refractory the next morning, an explanation had to be made to account for her absence from the breakfast table. Marilla told Matthew the whole story. Marilla and Matthew, just a little background story, Marilla and Matthew are a brother and sister who live in Prince Edward Island in Canada back around the later part of the 19th century. And because they are older and they're unable to care for their farm, they go to adopt a boy from an orphanage, and they end up with Anne instead. And Matthew kind of talks Marilla into keeping Anne, and they raise her. And so this part of the book is whenever Anne first comes to live with them, and they're still learning how to get along. So just to let you know who Marilla and Matthew are. Marilla told Matthew the whole story, taking pains to impress him with a due sense of enormity of Anne's behavior. It's a good thing Rachel Lynde got a calling down. She's a meddlesome old gossip, was Matthew's consolatory rejoinder. Matthew Cuthbert, I'm astonished at you. You know that Anne's behavior was dreadful, and yet you take her part. I suppose you'll be saying next thing that she oughtn't to be punished at all. Well, now, no, not exactly, said Matthew uneasily. I reckon she ought to be punished a little. But don't be too hard on her, Marilla. Recollect, she hasn't ever had anyone to teach her right. You're going to give her something to eat, aren't you? When did you ever hear of me starving people into good behavior? Demanded Marilla indignantly. She'll have her meals regular, and I'll carry them up to her myself, but she'll stay up there until you apologize to Miss Lynde. And that's final, Matthew. Breakfast, dinner, and supper were very silent meals for Anne. She still remained obdurate. After each meal, Marilla carried a well-filled tray to the east gable and brought it down later on, not noticeably depleted. Matthew eyed its last descent with a troubled eye. Had Anne eaten anything at all? When Marilla went out that evening to bring the cows back from the pasture, Matthew, who had been hanging about the barn and watching, slipped into the house with the air of a burglar. As a general thing, Matthew gravitated between the kitchen and the little bedroom off the hall where he slept. Once in a while he ventured uncomfortably into the parlor or sitting room where the minister came to tea, but he had never been upstairs in his own house since the spring he helped Marilla paper the spare bedroom, and that was 4 years ago. He tiptoed along the hall and stood for several minutes outside the door of the east gable before he summoned courage to tap on it with his fingers and then open the door to peep in. Anne was sitting on the yellow chair by the window, gazing mournfully out into the garden. Very small and unhappy she looked, and Matthew's heart smote him. He softly closed the door and tiptoed over to her. "Anne," he whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. "How are you making it, Anne?" Anne smiled wanly. "Pretty well. I imagine a good deal, and that helps to pass the time. Of course, it's rather lonesome, but then I may as well get used to that." Anne smiled again, bravely facing the long years of solitary imprisonment before her. Matthew recollected that he must say what he had come to say without loss of time, lest Marilla return prematurely. "Well, now, Anne, don't you think you'd better do it and have it over with?" "It'll have to be done sooner or later, you know, for Marilla's a dreadful determined woman, dreadful determined." "Do it right off, I say, and have it over." "Do you mean apologize to Mrs. Lynde?" "Yes, apologize, that's the very word," said Matthew. "Just smooth it over, so to speak. That's what I was trying to get at." "I suppose I could do it to oblige you," said Anne thoughtfully. "It would be true enough to say I am sorry, because I am sorry now. I wasn't a bit sorry last night. I was mad clear through, and I stayed mad all night. Up 3 times, and I was just furious every time. But this morning, it was all over. I wasn't in a temper any more, and it left a dreadful sort of goneness, too. I felt so ashamed of myself. But I just couldn't think of going and telling Mrs. Lynde so. It would be so humiliating. I made up my mind I'd stay shut up here forever rather than do that, but still, I'd do anything for you, if you really want me to." "Well, now, of course I do. It's terrible lonesome downstairs without you. Just go and smooth it over. That's a good girl." "Very well," said Anne resignedly. "I'll tell Marilla as soon as she comes in that I have repented." That's right, Anne. But don't tell Marilla I said anything about it. She might think I was putting my oar in, and I promised not to do that." Wild horses won't drag the secret from me," promised Anne solemnly. How would wild horses drag a secret from a person anyhow? But Matthew was gone, scared at his own success. He fled hastily to the remotest corner of the house, lest Marilla should suspect what he had been up to. Marilla herself, upon her return to the house, was agreeably surprised to hear a plaintive voice calling, "Marilla," over the banisters. "Well," she said, going into the hall, "I'm sorry I lost my temper and said rude things, and I'm willing to go and tell Miss Lynde so." "Very well." Marilla's crispness gave no sign to her relief. She had been wondering what under the canopy she should do if Anne did not give in. "I'll take you down after the milking." And so it goes on that Marilla goes to do the milking, and she comes back to collect Anne, and they go to visit Mrs. Lynde. And I'll hurry up so that we don't lose time to get to the best part of it. So they go on, and let's see. So Marilla and Anne are walking down the lane, and Anne is looking dejected. But halfway down the lane, Anne's dejection vanished as if by enchantment. She lifted her head and stepped lightly, her eyes fixed on the sunset sky, and an Anne of subdued exhilaration about her. Marilla beheld the change disapprovingly. This was no meek penitence, such as it behooved her to take into the presence of the offended Mrs. Lynde. "What are you thinking of, Anne?" she asked sharply. "I am imagining out what I must say to Mrs. Lynde," Anne said dreamily. This was satisfactory, or should have been so, but Marilla could not rid herself of the notion that something in her scheme of punishment was going askew. Anne had no business to look so rapt and radiant. They continued on until they were in the very presence of Mrs. Lynde, who was sitting knitting by her kitchen window. Then Anne's radiance vanished. Mournful penitence appeared on every feature. Before a word was spoken, Anne suddenly went down on her knees before the astonished Mrs. Rachel and held out her hands beseechingly. "Oh, Mrs. Lynde, I am so extremely sorry," she said it with a quiver in her voice. "I could never express all my sorrow, no, not if I used up a whole dictionary. You must imagine it. I've behaved terribly to you, and I've disgraced my dear friends, Matthew and Marilla, who have let me stay at although I'm not a boy. I'm dreadfully wicked and ungrateful, and I deserve to be punished and cast out by those respectful people forever. It was very wicked of me to fly into a temper, because you told me the truth. It was the truth. Every word you said was true. My hair is red, and I'm freckled and skinny and ugly. What I said to you was true, too, but I shouldn't have said it. Oh, Miss Lynde, please forgive me. If you refuse, it will be my lifelong sorrow. You wouldn't like to inflict a lifelong sorrow on a poor little orphan girl, would you? Even if she had a dreadful temper. Say you forgive me, Mrs. Lynde." Anne clasped her hands together, bowed her head, and waited for the word of judgment. There was no mistaking her sincerity. It breathed in every tone of her voice. Both Marilla and Mrs. Lynde recognized its unmistakable ring. But the former understood in dismay that Anne was actually enjoying her valley of humiliation, and was reveling in the thoroughness of her abasement. Where was the wholesome punishment upon which she, Marilla, had plumed herself? Anne had turned it into a species of positive. So Anne is an actor, or an actress. She likes to act, and she's very, very, trying to think of the right word. She's very rambunctious, and she's very imaginative and creative, and she likes to imagine herself in a fairy tale a lot with her friends that she meets in Avonlea, the little town that she ends up living in. But she meant what she said in anger to Mrs. Lynde, but later on, after this apology is made, and she makes quite a few other mistakes along the way, she really learns to love Mrs. Lynde, and Mrs. Lynde really learns to love her through all of the books in the entire saga. What we need to learn is, while we might mean the ugly things that we say, while we are very angry, we might mean them at the time, and it might still hurt our feelings and make us angry to think of the person that makes us angry saying those things or doing what they did. Sometimes, for our own sake and the sake of those around us, sometimes we have to swallow our pride, even if it is embarrassing to have to apologize, which was Anne. She was very afraid that she was going to be humiliated by apologizing to Mrs. Lynde. She did it anyway, and she learned to have a lifelong love with Mrs. Lynde and Marilla and Matthew. So if you ever get the chance, pick these up. They're wonderful books. They have been my favorite since I was a little girl. And you'll learn all about Anne's adventures and a lot of the things that she learns about her character, and being mindful, because she learns that too. You can learn a lot from Miss Anne. All right, guys, have a wonderful Thursday. I will hopefully see you tomorrow, since I think that I've gotten my technical issues figured out. Have a thoroughly tremendous Thursday. Get outside and enjoy the sunshine. Bye, everybody.